Salams from the People's Dispatch Studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani and you're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, we discuss Canada's ongoing crisis. We have the latest from Europe. And finally, an update on India's very important election season. First up, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is demanding an end to a protest by hundreds of truckers that has paralyzed the capital city, Ottawa. Ottawa administration has reached out to the federal government for help in dealing with the situation. The disingenuously named Freedom Convoy began setting up in Ottawa late in January to denounce an order requiring truck drivers to be fully vaccinated against COVID-19 if they wish to cross Canada's land border with the United States. The protests were organized by known far-right figures who've espoused Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, and other hateful views, according to the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, which is a non-profit. They have since morphed into wider protests against COVID-19 health restrictions and the Trudeau government, bringing Ottawa to a standstill for over a week. Prashant, a difficult situation, talks maybe of the military being brought in, the Canadian capital completely paralyzed. What's the latest?
Right, Siddhant. So like you said, this has been going on for about 10 days now, almost close to 10 days, and it's called the Freedom Convoy, which itself is a very ironic term in some senses. There's a lot to really unpack here because I think this, this issue is, there are multiple issues that kind of are all mixed up in this, and it's actually not only of importance to Canada but across the world. So let's take them one by one. One of the core issues, of course, is the issue of mandates and public restrictions on COVID-19. So the ostensible reason for these protests was that, like you said, Canadian truckers were, if they're not vaccinated, had to take a 14-day quarantine if they crossed over from the United States. Now, 90% of the truckers in Canada are vaccinated. So it's an important question as to who these people who are protesting in large numbers are. And I think that's where this issue has sort of kind of got connected to basically a lot of far-right politics itself. So we do know that in various countries in the world, especially in Europe and the global north in general, there have been a lot of protests against what are public mandates, public restrictions on the issue of COVID-19. Yeah. And now there is this, intersection between legitimate concerns of working people, of people who have felt, the heavy burden of these restrictions and the absence of proper governmental support. That's a very, very important thing. The fact that a lot of people have been abandoned by, or they feel abandoned by their governments during this time of crisis, because the restrictions are just one aspect of it. We're talking about social welfare policies, we're talking about job cuts, we're talking about salary decreases. So that's one aspect. But this has also proved a very fertile ground for the far right to mobilize against existing governments, to promote, like you said, a lot of hateful views, to promote anti-minority views in many parts of the world, and to generally to promote this sort of anti-establishment view, which in its own way actually benefits, which is actually a part of majoritarianism in some senses. So we need to be very cognizant of this when we sort of understand things like the truckers' strike over here. Now, it is, of course, it is possible that some of the people here, are coming out of a genuine sense of grievance, are coming out of a genuine sense of feeling, completely restricted and closed by the policies of the Canadian government, for instance. But let us be very clear that there is a very clear far-right element as well. In fact, a good example of the fact is that they have raised about $10 million. GoFundMe, which is the official funding platform, distanced itself after a while because they were like, this is a problematic form of fundraising. These protests have been endorsed by noted far-right figures across from various sections of the West. Trump, of course, was in the forefront of it. Elon Musk. When such people back these protests, you automatically have certain questions. And there has not been, for instance, a lot of the truck drivers in Canada are migrants, and their issues have not really been brought in. But if you look at some of the analysis, what comes out is also that this is not a working class protest in the way it is being portrayed in some sections. This is not a protest this is a protest in which certain far-right agendas and dissatisfaction with the Canadian government and its policies is being channelized in extremely problematic directions. And a lot of experts have pointed out that, one, this is being driven by a very strong right-wing establishment, a lot of it based in the United States, and also supported by the main opposition Conservative Party in Canada, for instance. They have really sort of tried to use this to push, to sort of corner Justin Trudeau. And let's be honest here, Justin Trudeau's government has not covered itself with any glory over the past few years. It is the failure again and time and again of many of these governments in the global north, so to speak, to actually put in place good social policies during the pandemic to provide the right kind of aid and assistance to the majority of the people during this pandemic, which has actually led towards these kind of mobilizations. And it's important to, I think, also note that protests like these tend to take the politics of society itself generally rightwards.
Yeah.
Right. So now this is a difficult situation because, if, like you said, this, for instance, the military is brought in, it might cause a huge mess. It might cause a massive problem. Negotiations are likely, it's difficult to sort of break the deadlock. So very difficult situation overall for the Canadian government.
So what are the options that Trudeau and at least the federal government have in front of them?
Like I said, the federal government strategy has been to sort of brand them as, right-wing troublemakers completely,
Fringe elements.
and almost refuse to negotiate with them. Now, the conservative opposition is using this as a way to sort of attack demanding negotiations. Although on what on what grounds these negotiations can take place is actually a problem. Is a difficult terrain. But I think that whether a completely law and order perspective is going to work on these protests is really something we need to see. But there is definitely, I think, a larger need for mobilization. It is already happening in certain places. Left-wing mobilizations, working class mobilizations, pushing back at some of the claims that are being made, pushing back at some of the manifestations that are taking place in these protests itself. So it's, like I said, it's a very troublesome kind of a phase. And there have been people, for instance, who have called it as a continuation of the January 6th mob in the Capitol Hill in the United States last year, Donald Trump supporters, because there are some similarities in the way. And in fact, we do see that right-wing groups in the United States are also mobilizing in a similar fashion to sort of take advantage of this situation. So I think this is actually in some sense is a continuation of, I think, years of government policy, years of government neglect, not only in Canada and various parts of the world, like I said, which has failed to provide, and also important thing to note, which has also, I think, failed to honestly address people, convince them, there is an issue of scientific education, of scientific temper, because a lot of people just see a complete chaotic response by various governments. They're changing positions at various points of time, not really clearly able to explain to people why such restrictions should exist, what are the advantages. And this also points to a failure of the fact that there are no good, proper public health systems in many of these countries, right? The fact that health is so privatized basically also means that there are no outreach campaigns that are possible. There is probably very little community mobilizing that is taking place, that is supported by the government at various levels, which can actually take many of these messages to people and explain why such and such thing is necessary. So I think that is actually one of the underlying failures that we need to really sort of understand over here, that if people feel abandoned, if people feel that they are not being, their needs are not being considered, there is definitely a very strong element to that. Now, it is unfortunately being channeled in this direction is also an important thing to note, but the failure of, if you can call it, the neoliberal governments in all these countries to sort of take it seriously has also contributed to this crisis.
It will also be interesting to see how the same neoliberal governments deal with these protests vis-a-vis how they've dealt with, let's say, student mobilizations or working class mobilizations in the past few months.
Exactly.
All right. Thanks for that update, Prashant. We'll move on to Europe, where Russian President Vladimir Putin has said that he was ready for compromise and would look at proposals put forward by the French leader, Emmanuel Macron, during talks on Monday. While, of course, he is still talking about the West being responsible for raising tensions over Ukraine. Emerging from a 5-hour-long meeting at the Kremlin, the two leaders voiced hope that a solution could be found to what is the worst crisis between Russia and the West since the end of the Cold War. Macron, meanwhile, said that intensive discussions are still required to de-escalate the crisis and that the next few days would be crucial. He also added, and I quote now, "There is no security for the Europeans if there is no security for Russia." An important meeting in some sense, Prashant. We've spoken about the role that France is playing and Germany is playing in this crisis. What do you make of events?
Right, so another week, another conversation, or two maybe, who knows what's happening this week about Russia and Europe. But I would say an important conversation because this in some senses marks yet another step in a process we have talked about, in which there is some amount of internal confusion within NATO and the Western Alliance itself on what to do right now. So we have the United States and the United Kingdom, which are taking a far more hawkish stance. We have some of the East European countries who are closely aligned to the US and the UK, taking also a very hawkish stance. And we have the Western European countries, excluding the UK, which are a bit more, say, ambivalent about the whole situation.
Maybe a bit more pragmatic.
A bit more pragmatic, exactly. And I think France and Germany are at the forefront of this group, so to speak. So, French President Emmanuel Macron, of course, trying to burnish his credentials as a European leader. He's going for elections in April, so he's visited Moscow. I think he's in Kiev today, if I'm not mistaken, as well. And the discussions, like we said, it's interesting because he did, of course, say that the aspect you mentioned, the collective security of Europe and Russia are closely interlinked. And this is something the Russians have also been saying, that it is an issue of, you cannot take just Ukraine in isolation and talk about Ukraine's security without talking about the security of its neighbors, etc., etc. So, in some senses, there is a broad alignment of, I think, ideas now. A lot of it is not going to come out in the media because these are discussions. Probably, Macron is carrying some proposals. Putin did say that some of the proposals Macron had put forward could be worked on. There was a possibility for that. So we do know that, Macron is going to probably discuss this with the Ukrainian president, Ukrainian officials as well, and then update Putin on that. So we can probably see some kind of, hopefully we can see some kind of a track of discussions. We do know that earlier the Germans and the French, the Russians and the Ukrainians had met as part of what is called the Normandy Protocol. They had agreed on some kind of ceasefire mechanisms, for instance. But all in all, I would think this is probably a positive step. One wouldn't be too hopeful because we'll talk about this later. There are other countervailing tendencies also at work within Europe itself. But nonetheless, if they're able to build some kind, these discussions keep going on, continuing itself, is it a positive sign because it sort of gives the indication that there is still some scope for dialogue, there is still some scope for consideration, and that things will not be pushed too much beyond a point.
Yeah. So, like you were saying, it's a hectic week of diplomatic activity all across Europe on multiple fronts. So, what else is going on apart from these big meetings?
Right. So, Germany also getting into the act. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was in Washington, where he met with Joe Biden. Now, Biden declared that if there was any kind of invasion, the Nord Stream 2 project, which is of vital importance to Germany and Russia, would be scrapped. Olaf Scholz notably did not say that. So it's important to note that he was asked on CNN about it. He did not give an open commitment saying that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline would be scrapped.
Right.
In fact, he said that we have to keep our options open. We don't want to reveal too much. But I think that itself is an indication that Germany and the United States are a bit on different tracks over here. We also do know that the United States. Biden spent a lot of time saying that Germany is on our side, Germany is reliable, which I think raises the question as to whether US officials actually think so. So there's definitely, I think, a slight divergence between the United States and Germany on these issues. We also know that the German foreign minister was in Kiev, where the Ukrainians were not very enthusiastic. The Ukrainian President Zelensky did not meet her. They say it's a scheduling error, but I believe the Ukrainians are not very happy with the fact that Germany is not sending military supplies to Ukraine. So they offered helmets some weeks ago, and they have sent a few hundred troops to Lithuania, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. But Germany, I think, is seeing this very from a very different paradigm. They're very worried about energy supplies, and we also need to note that a lot of estimates say that Europe is going to suffer far more than Russia if energy ties are cut. Russia has recently once again signed an agreement with China. They're going to work on that a bit more. It has a good foreign currency reserves, foreign exchange reserves, which means that Russia could maybe tide over some of the impact of the sanctions. Europe might struggle a bit more. And meanwhile, of course, the European Union and the US did a meeting on diversifying energy supplies. Easier said than done, I suspect, because while considering the pace at which things are going, it's not going to be that easy to replace what Russian energy comes to Europe. And then, of course, NATO, meanwhile, has been saber-rattling, talking about increasing its military defenses and military deployments. So overall, I think a lot of rhetoric going on, and a lot of the divergences in the Western alliance are kind of really beginning to show. And this is probably what Russians also in some senses wanted, because I think they knew that this whole facade of unity being put by the Western powers is actually not the case. All of these countries have different agenda, they have different interests, they have different issues of concern, and a lot of these are actually beginning to show, and the West, I think, is trying to hide it with a lot of rhetoric, talking about the common enemy Russia, which might invade any moment, the massing of Russian troops, etc., etc.
Repeated again yesterday.
Exactly. So, Whether this is, I think so coming days and weeks definitely going to be crucial. One can hope that, say, Macron's diplomacy or, diplomacy in general is able to lower tensions because things are still, very, very dicey right now.
Meanwhile, if I'm not wrong, the US has quietly emerged as the largest gas exporter in the world. So that's also going on. All right. Thanks so much, Prashant, for being back on Daily Debrief. Our final story, 5 Indian states will hold elections to their respective legislative assemblies starting in just a couple of days on Feb 10th. The states are as diverse and disparate as Manipur, which lies in the country's northeast and shares a border with Myanmar and has just under 3 million residents, whereas Uttar Pradesh, India's most populous, has over 200 million. Of the 5 states, only Punjab in the north is currently run by the Indian National Congress. The others, including Goa and Uttarakhand, are all governed by the Bharatiya Janata Party and its allies. The BJP, you might also know, forms the Indian central government under the Prime Ministership of Narendra Modi. We promised you updates from this enormous democratic endeavor, and to that end, we have in the house today NewsClick editor Pranjal. Pranjal, you've been on the show before and talked about some of these issues. Why is this phase so important from a national perspective?
So, Siddhan, you need to first, let's go back into a bit of history. And yesterday we see how Prime Minister Narendra Modi kept on attacking the opposition instead of replying to the president's address. That tells you what's the state of affair when it comes to these elections. These elections are going to determine what is going to happen in 2024 parliamentary elections. You have Punjab, you have Uttarakhand, you have Uttar Pradesh, and Goa and Manipur are that way smaller states. Uttar Pradesh has around 80 parliamentary constituencies. These 400 plus seats are also going to determine how people are going to vote in those 80 constituencies. Right now, BJP has around 64 out of 80 seats. If they even lose 10 to 20 seats out of that 84, they might come below majority mark in 2024. So it's a break or make election for them. And since Uttar Pradesh is the biggest state vis-a-vis parliamentary number of seats, and also in terms of state assembly seats. This is going to leave a big impact not only on northern Indian states but also on the politics of the entire country. Later this year you have Gujarat elections, you have Himachal Pradesh elections. If BJP loses Uttar Pradesh, it's going to have an impact on these 2 states also. And the next year you have 5 big North Indian states going for polls. 4 or 5 big North Indian states going for polls, where BJP is anyway on a weak turf. So if they lose Uttar Pradesh, their chances of winning these elections also become very, it gets difficult for them. So that's why this entire focus of the ruling dispensation is how to win elections in Uttar Pradesh. They're not worried about Punjab, they're not worried about Uttarakhand, they're not worried about Goa. The only state right now which they care about is Uttar Pradesh. So that's one. Also, as I have pointed it out earlier, Uttar Pradesh also determines, this is also a state which also sees massive migration to other states. UP, Bihar, other states where people go to other states to work. So they also influence voting pattern in those states as well.
Absolutely.
So if they are able to retain UP, they will also be able to influence elections in other states as well. Second, Uttar Pradesh is also laboratory for their experiments. So when it comes to communal politics, when it comes to divide and rule, BJP has been playing that card very often in Uttar Pradesh. And if they win, then it means that these policies have been successfully implemented. And hence they can also keep preaching this politics till 2024 and also pitch their entire 24 election on these issues instead of talking about development, employment, inflation, the crisis during COVID times where they have utterly failed. So they're testing the waters right now. And if they succeed, then these are also the things they are going to continuously keep doing. If they lose, then they might have to come on a back foot. Because then this politics of Hindutva, the right-wing politics, would have clearly failed in state of Uttar Pradesh, which has seen massive polarizations in past many years. We've also witnessed one of the biggest riots in Uttar Pradesh in 2013. And that's how they won almost 70 seats in 2014. So this is why these state elections are very important.
Right, almost impossible to really compare, Pranjal, like you pointed out, the differences between the various states. But is there a commonality of some of the issues that at least people are talking about, or people want the government to address? Because, like we've also mentioned, four of these 5 states are ruled by the BJP.
BJP. So there are two kinds of things we can discuss here. One are issues that the BJP is raising. One are the issues that are actually there and people want it to be raised. The issues which BJP is raising, what is it? Polarization on Hindu-Muslim votes. How nationalism needs to be intensified. How the opposition is basically anti-nation. These are the issues that the BJP, the ruling party, is raising. But when we talk about these states, we have seen massive unemployment. The recent CMI data points out that how most of these states have witnessed a massive job loss in past 2 years since the pandemic has struck. That's one. UP primarily is known for COVID mismanagement. We can't forget those visuals where, if I'm not wrong, it was Danish Siddiqui's photo of rioters where you could see bodies being burnt in Delhi and in states in UP, in other states, and also bodies on the river belt. So COVID has been one of the biggest, health sector crisis is one of the biggest thing that these states are facing. Then you have inflation. You see the prices of petrol and diesel. They are going up every day. The prices of food grains have increased. The prices of edible oils have increased. And people are suffering. They had promised gas cylinders. Now when the fuel prices are increasing, the cost of cylinders have also been increased. So these are the issues which people want to focus on. I think unemployment is one of the biggest issues that all these states have in common, apart from inflation, health sector crisis, all these issues. But unemployment remains one of the prime focus in all these states, and that is where, if you see the opposition campaign, that is where these people have been, opposition parties have been talking about. UP, Punjab are also states which are agrarian-based states. Agriculture is one of the biggest source of incomes for many people in these states. As we have recently witnessed the massive farmers agitation because of the farm laws on which the government went back. They promised that they will form a committee for MSP. They will ensure that that committee is formed, minimum support price is provided. They said that the minister whose son is responsible for killing 4 people in Uttar Pradesh will be removed, and many such things had been promised. None of these things have been fulfilled till now. And that's why the farmers' agitation has decided to continue the campaign against the ruling party in all these states. So agrarian crisis is also going to be one of the big issues, especially in western Uttar Pradesh and in Punjab. And that's where the ruling party in Punjab, that is Congress, has been talking about how they have worked for farmers. But let's not deny that even the employment crisis in Punjab is at a very high stage right now.
All right, Pranjal, Feb 10th is when the action begins. You'll have your hands full, but hopefully you'll join us back on Daily Debrief for updates for our international audience. That's all we have on the show for today. From Pranjal, myself, and the entire People's Dispatch team, thank you very much for watching. For more on all these stories, you can visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and give us a follow on all the regular social media platforms for updates. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.